2, 1. Hey guys, this is Paul. Welcome to the Ultimate Trainer Podcast. Today we've got a very special guest on the show, Victor Black. Victor, how are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing very well, Paul. Thank you very much for asking. I asked you before we started the call. I didn't realize you're from Australia. You realize I'm Australian by birth, yeah?
Yes. Where were you born?
I was born in a small country town in South Australia called Macclesfield.
Oh, okay.
I don't know whether you know. No one's ever heard of it. Like, had a population of 100. So a rural boy growing up and joined the military at 17 and then moved to the eastern seaboard. But yes, Australian by birth.
Never heard it, but I actually own will be 3 gyms in September in Adelaide. So
you must know where Mount Barker is. I'm guessing you know where Mount Barker is. Yes. Okay. So Macclesfield is a small satellite town that kind of feeds off Mount Barker. Okay. I went to Mount Barker High School.
Okay. There
was the town was so small. We only had a 2-teacher primary school. All the kids were into 2 classrooms, and then when you go to high school, you went to Mount Barker. So I know Australia very well.
Very, very good. Now, why we have you on today is you are the founder of Safer Use in Anabolic Steroids and Performance Enhancing Drugs. And like with what we do with MPC and Meldrum Performance Coaching, I coach a bunch of people who are using performance enhancing drugs. And I have a lot of students who are obviously interested in performance enhancing drugs. I think if you're in the fitness industry, there's certainly something that comes on your radar at some point, particularly if you're interested in body composition changes or high level performance. And what I want to do was go straight to the horse's mouth on the man who put together the Safer Use models, rather than me just parroting them and trying to take credit.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Can I just add in there, just for your audience, just as an awareness for coaches looking at career development? Yeah. Yep. I think it's important to point out, historically, discussions around performance enhancing drugs, and specifically we used to really talk about anabolic steroids in that context, was always taboo. It was a taboo subject. But I think it's fair to say, if we're honest now, we have millions and millions and millions of young men and women using these drugs, and so coaches need to have at least a foundational level of knowledge, so they're not providing myth and bro science sort of to clients when they engage with them. And even more importantly than that, I would argue for career development moving forward, this is only going to expand. This niche is only going to expand. But what I would argue is that fewer and fewer people are going to be interested in unsustainable abusive practices, and more people are going to be interested in what I call more than TRT.
Yeah,
so that the older men and older women that maybe have had some exposure to testosterone replacement therapy practices or hormonal replacement practices and went, well, that was awesome, like that was life-changing. What else is there? Yeah. This is, in my opinion, the growth market for the next 10 years in coaching. It's not abusive, unsustainable practice. It's literally more than TRT. So just as an awareness for coaches, that I think this is going to be a massive up growth in the market. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And even the understanding of the safer use principles and what I've learned from them has been really fundamental in helping me resolve physiological issues that have been caused by the abuse of anabolic steroids and the blast cruise models, or just all right, cool, here's a female client, your first 6 weeks in the gym, let's blast some Anavar and let's take let's just take a bunch of tablets each day, and here's 3 caps of Clen every day, go for it. And that, I've worked with multiple female athletes who have had dysmenorrhea, altered period cycles, plus relative energy deficiency syndrome. And by using these models, the black models, we've been able to basically resolve them, rebuild fertility in the female, but also, make them feel good and actually enjoy training again, which has been a totally amazing process. So thank you for putting together.
That's awesome. Very good. Cool. So I'm an open book. Why don't you lead the conversation about what you feel that your audience would like to focus on?
Perfect. Awesome. So basically, what you've put together with the safer use model is a really cool process where it's looking at using, for lack of a better term, the minimal effective dose of multiple drugs before you get a side effect, and you get the most positive effects versus lowest amount of side effects. And you address so you remove unnecessary risk, which I think is really, really important. And then what I really would talk about is the premise of moderate modulation of multiple metabolic pathways, and the fact that I really like the model only uses human-approved stuff.
Yeah. So I think to fully understand the models, you have to understand what historical practice was. Yep. What did we do before the black models? Yeah. And it's really simple to describe. We fundamentally all started, whether we're talking about men or women, we all started with anabolic steroids.
Yep.
Okay. And we typically only used anabolic steroids. We contained the conversation really fundamentally to anabolic steroids. I would go one step further and say, 15 years ago, if you were asking for advice from someone in this space, literally people would say, look, you're not a professional athlete. You don't need to concern yourself with drugs like recombinant human growth hormone and recombinant insulin and other drugs. Like just stick with anabolic steroids. That's the domain of the professional. And of course, the argument is, the problem is, but anabolic steroids are the most toxic class of drug that we use as performance-enhancing drugs. So you're literally saying to the recreational user, look, just stick with the most toxic drugs. It's the silliest possible advice. And so the logic says, well, what we used to do is we all, and not everybody, I agree, but as a general rule of thumb, you would say, okay, so women all started with Anavar. That's the drug that most women were first exposed to. And they started with a moderate dose and they slowly escalated the dose over time. That was the model. Yeah. Men typically started with testosterone and they escalated the dose until they reached a point of toxicity where they literally could not handle any more anabolic steroids. And it was only once you reached a point of certain toxicity that you even considered opening up another metabolic pathway. So the basic premise is this, and that is, rather than taking out a 20-pound sledgehammer and smashing on one of these pathways, specifically the androgen receptor with anabolic steroids, why can we not approach this from a perspective of the moderate modulation of multiple pathways, literally right out the gate?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a 180-degree, flipping on its head of our historical practices. And the entire point is not to suggest that this in any way works better. I've never suggested that this is a better model from an outcome point. What I'm suggesting is we know what works, and we've been doing what works for 30 years. I'm in my mid-50s, and I would argue that bodybuilders haven't gotten any bigger or any better on stage in 30 years.
Agreed.
And people could argue, there are even people out there that would argue that the 90s were the pinnacle of bodybuilding. I don't necessarily support that myself. I think that's rose-colored glasses. But what I would argue is you could take Ronnie Coleman and put him on the stage today and it'd still be Ronnie Coleman. He'd still probably win, right?
Yeah, agreed.
Because it could be, and the point I'm making is nothing has really changed in bodybuilding in 30 years beyond one conversation, and that's the conversation about harm reduction.
Yeah.
So all of this, the entire conversation is literally leading down the path of, okay, we know what works. I have a saying I like to use. It says, look, at some point, if you want to continue to add skeletal muscle to your frame, you are going to need growth promoters.
Yes.
Right? And growth promoters work. Everything else past that is really a conversation about, so are you interested in harm reduction or do you not care?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the foundation of the models. We're not proposing this is, something that's going to add 20 pounds to the frame of bodybuilders' historical outcomes. It's not bigger, it's not better. It's literally a discussion around harm reduction.
Yeah. And I think it's really awesome. And I love what you put out in your content, where if someone's not going to be at that top level from a genetic perspective, they don't have the genes to play the game. Like I know I certainly don't have the genes to play the game at the top level, so there's no way I'm going to be going through a blast cruise cycle. I think that this is it's a really good model to be able to use with the general population who are that 95, 99, well, probably 99% who are never going to place it in the show.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes common sense when you think about it. You're going, well, I think that if you've been doing this and doing it right for 5 or 6 years, yeah, you should be able to, and what I mean by 5 or 6 years, I mean, let's just pick an avatar and say, so let's describe a man. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's been training naturally for 3 years, right? His first year was great. His second year, he saw some diminishing returns. His third year, he saw yet again diminishing returns. This is just the nature of natural training. Yeah. He then opens the door into the world of enhancement practices, and he has, again, two or three good years. After 5 or 6 years of exposure to our world, you could tell whether that guy is a contender or not. You could just tell, right? Now, if he's a contender, what I propose is we take him into a separate side room and have a conversation with him about, how we get the most number of successful career years for him. Yeah. But accept the fact that he is going to have to cycle stress. There's no question that you have to do that. But what I would argue is, if you do this for a number of years and you don't have what it takes, like myself, yeah, or as you said yourself, then really you should be in a different room having a completely different conversation about completely different parameters, which is ultimately one about longevity.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not how do I compete for the next 5 years without coming unstuck, but how do I engage in enhanced practices and enjoy what I love for the next 35 years? It's a completely different vector, and the vector that changes is time.
Yeah, you still get to be jacked and look awesome.
Correct, because anyone that suggests that you can blast cruise for 35 years doesn't understand the reality consequence of the use of these compounds. Yeah. You cannot do that. You can do that for you get a certain block of time of what I call high stress practice. And it's overstating the risk to say that you don't get 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. You do, but you don't get 35 years of it. You just don't.
No, it's not feasible for anyone to survive that.
Right.
Cool. So we're going to look at what you've put together from that. So with that understanding that, all right, cool, we're going to address multiple metabolic pathways or multiple muscle building pathways that we can utilize with clients, athletes, etc., to get the most out of them and also reduce harm. So the basics, I'm not going to go through every single part of it because there's quite a few things there. The first principle is just baseline T, testosterone as much as you can tolerate with no AI and no DHT.
Yeah, maybe I can just throw something in between that, because I'm happy to have that conversation. But I think it's easier if you say this. Look, androgens, testosterone and anabolic steroids, plus growth hormone, plus insulin are really the 3 primary enhancement pathways. They're the 3 primary ones. There's a whole bunch of other ones that are very interesting, but they're less robust in terms of what we know about them and what we see people doing. And what I mean by that, things like myostatin inhibition. It's a very interesting conversation, but anyone that's evidence-based finds themselves in a position of saying, look, we don't have incredibly robust clinical literature, and we don't have incredibly robust observation and anecdote that goes back 30 years that talks about myostatin inhibition. Yeah. Testosterone, insulin, and growth hormone are 3 of the most studied drugs in all pharmacology. It's almost an inexhaustible amount of content that we have available to understand these drugs and their consequence in terms of application. Yeah. So the point I'm making is there's a total of 13 different metabolic pathways that we could modulate. And what I'm proposing is, as I said at the beginning, rather than taking out a 20-pound sledgehammer and hitting on the androgen receptor, I'm suggesting that we share the load. We spread the stresses, as it were, across all 13 of those pathways. So if we look at that and say, so this testosterone, which obviously binds with the androgen receptor and causes a cascade of events that are positive in terms of body composition shift. Yep. There's also what we call non-classic genomic signaling pathways, which is what relationship does testosterone and its derivatives, anabolic steroids, have that are not via the androgen receptor.
Yeah, so that's your DHTs, yeah?
Not necessarily. So dihydrotestosterone derivatives still bind with the androgen receptor, yeah? But it's also true that there are other receptors I'll give you a simple example. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of sex hormone binding globulin. Most people are familiar with this thing, right? Yeah. So you understand that there is a receptor for sex hormone binding globulin. It does stuff, right? Yeah. So when either an androgen, testosterone, or estrogen binds with sex binding hormone globulin, then what happens is that combined unit is then capable of binding with a sex hormone binding receptor, okay? and causing a separate cascade of events which are not via the androgen receptor. So it's the same molecules, in this case, testosterone and estrogen, but first binds with sex hormone binding globulin and then binds with the sex hormone binding globulin receptor, and then a cascade of events spells forth, which are completely disparate to what happens when testosterone binds with the androgen receptor. And we call these things non-classical genomic signaling pathways. Yeah. And the point I'm making is there's more than one pathway. Yeah. A simple analogy would be here. If someone said to me, okay, what's more important, training or food? These are two different discussions, but in my opinion, they both hold merit, and you have to have the conversation about both. You cannot just have the conversation about one. And so the point I'm making is estrogen is a hypertrophic pathway in its own right. Okay, so testosterone is metabolized into estrogen. Estrogen then binds with estrogen receptors, and the estrogen receptors are a hormonal hypertrophic pathway in its own right. In fact, that's the pathway that is proposed that drugs like testosterone, you and your followers probably know what testosterone is, right, is proposed to work via. So it's the proposition it doesn't work via the androgen receptor to cause hypertrophic response. It works via the estrogen receptors to cause hypertrophic response. The whole point being is there's multiple pathways, and ideally what we want to do is we modulate them. So now, then we start with where you were going with. So the first drug in, the first cab off the rank for men, at least, and we could talk about women in it, is logically and rationally what we would do is we would elevate the hormone testosterone in the human male physiology.
Yeah.
So if a man presented to you and he had testosterone levels of, let's just arguably say 600 nanograms per deciliter, I'm sure everyone listening understands that what is plausible naturally is significantly higher than that. We have natural athletes walking around at double that value, you know, and more. So the obvious question would be, if we took someone that was walking around at 600 nanograms per deciliter, we did nothing more than slowly titrate those levels up, those serum levels of testosterone. Eventually, inevitably, assuming that you have, you know, training practices and nutritional practices in play and assorted, one would expect to see an improvement in body composition outcomes, new skeletal muscle tissue, and at the same time a loss of body fat. Yeah. So that's the first pathway, testosterone. Now, testosterone itself then is metabolized into DHT and is metabolized into estrogen. Estrogen is the secondary pathway. It produces a hypertrophic response by itself. Where you were going to with DHT was, it's not well understood that aggression and what we call force production outcomes are not actually seen by the androgen receptor. They tend to be seen by other pathways, and DHT is more responsible for force production outcomes than it is for new skeletal muscle tissue. So the point here is testosterone, DHT, and estrogen are all separate pathways, and they're all valid, and they're all viable, and they're all important. And what I would rather see is we moderately lift all three of those upwards, rather than suppressing estrogen through the use of an aromatase inhibitor, suppressing DHT through the use of DHT blocking, and simply pounding on the androgen receptor, hoping to get the same outcome. Does it make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I've spent a lot of time telling a lot of people not to use AIs.
Yeah.
Like why they went straight away, they want to blast. I've had one former client come to me. He's like, "Cool, I'm going to blast some tests, some trends, some boldenone using AI." That's what the guy in the street told me. And then I'll do some debol after that. I was like, what are you trying to achieve here? And I was like, you're literally compromising one pathway, compromising your health, or one thing, and you're using stuff that hasn't been approved for human use. Do you really want to do that?
Yeah. And we have to be empathetic when people say that, because to be honest with you, that's the works model. That's the model that we've been using for 20 years. And I promise you this, and that is, if you went away and did it, it's going to work.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is the challenge whenever you're having a conversation with someone who's a layman and perhaps outside the scope of harm reduction contests, you know, they're going to be asking the question, well, does it work? It works. It's a conversation about, just because it works doesn't necessarily mean it's the best option. It's literally, you have option A, and you have option B, and you have multiple options that spill forth from that. It's all about sitting down and saying, look, if all of these options are going to produce an outcome that's acceptable to you, why would we not lean into the lowest risk option?
I should have prefixed that with saying it was his third time around doing that. While having to wash off the.
So he knows it works.
He knows it works. He also knows how much it hurts.
He knows the consequences. Correct.
Now, what I loved, you said that the HGH pathway and also the insulin fuel supply efficacy pathway are the next two things that you would target for hypertrophy. So would that be, you'll be talking about the use of things like metformin and actual using insulin analogs in the practice of sustainable bodybuilding, I guess.
Yeah. So just to be super clear, let's say there are 13 different metabolic pathways that we could modulate. Yep. Yeah. Logically and rationally, you say, well, there must be a sequence in which we would turn them on, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
But one has to understand that, but we're already modulating them as natural bodybuilders. What I mean by that is, so every natural bodybuilder on the planet is already leveraging testosterone, estrogen, DHT, insulin, and growth hormone already. So really what we're talking about is, so in what sequence of events do we escalate them beyond physiological range? Does that make sense? So even when you put testosterone in play, like as first gambit, as first line of action, as first exposure, it's important to understand that parallel to that, you still have insulin in play, but you have physiological levels of insulin in play.
That's a super physiological.
Yeah. So we're talking about not going from the light switches off to the light switches on, but rather, okay, so we're turning the dimmer. Yeah, we're going to turn the dimmer up. And so what would make sense is we escalate androgens first. Why? Because they are probably the most potent drug in terms of response. Yeah. Yep. And what I mean by that is, you could just give someone anabolic steroids and you would see a profound change in their physiology and body composition. If you just gave someone insulin, you would not see that change. We could have an interesting conversation about what would you see, but the point is not of the same magnitude.
Yeah.
So we start with the most potent drug first, but we're always mindful of the fact that, yes, okay, they work the best, but they're also the most toxic. So what I would propose is you start there and escalate to the point whereby you have acceptable and sustainable levels of stress in play. Yep. And then we walk to the next pathway, which would logically be either insulin, the insulin pathway, or the growth hormone pathway. You could substitute them either way. Most people, most of the time, would start with growth hormone, and then they would go to insulin. And then when you have those multiple, so you have the androgen pathway, the estrogen pathway, the growth hormone pathway, the insulin pathway in place. Once you've got those four pathways in place, you start to fall back into, ever smaller discussions like myostatin inhibition and these types of conversations. So yes,
okay.
In terms of, you asked the question about what would that look like? Yes. So the first gambit would be, I would argue that even natural bodybuilders would be having some of these conversations, like, how do I get the maximum testosterone production I can out of my body?
Yeah.
How do I get the most growth hormone out of my body? How can I produce the most insulin so I can leverage that out of my body? Yeah, the same conversations. And in terms of insulin sensitivity, provided we're talking about drugs that allow natural athletes to compete under the rules of tested federations, we would be having conversations about things like insulin sensitizers that are not pharmaceutical grade,
like
approved compounds. Yep. So berberine is the classic example. So typically what the journey looks like is, even before an athlete becomes enhanced, they've had some exposure to these practices because they've used something like berberine. And then when we remove the need for testing, we can start to talk about metformin. I would argue that metformin and berberine do somewhat similar things. They have very different mechanisms of action, but they're really insulin sensitizers. Yeah.
Great.
And then the logic beyond that becomes, and then we would walk in a basal insulin on top of that. So it'd be cumulative. And then we would walk in a rapid acting insulin on top of that. So we have, berberine, metformin as base, and then basal insulin, and then a rapid acting insulin on top. So the point is, it's a logical stepwise sequence of events, but the difference between what we're doing here is that we're leaning into human clinical use drugs, I would argue it's impossible to argue that you need to expose yourself to drugs that have not been in human clinical use. And I would even argue further that what we should be doing is using drugs that are not only human clinical use drugs, but they're human clinical use drugs in lifetime use.
Yeah.
And so what that changes the discussion from, is it okay to use these drugs? And it changes the conversation from, is it okay to use these drugs for many years, into a discussion which is really about, well, how much you're going to take.
Yeah.
The
how
dose.
Much can you handle that?
Correct. And how much you can tolerate as an individual. Correct. So it's very interesting, because whilst you operate in the world of, unapproved drugs, research chemicals, and whilst you work in the world of drugs that are only used acutely for a few weeks and then put aside, it's very hard to argue a sustainable model, because we just don't have credible supporting evidence. But the Black models are based, as I said, on lifetime clinical use, human use drugs. And it changes the conversation profoundly, because there are literally millions of people around the world using these drugs every single day of their life, and they will to the day they die.
Yeah.
So it's a very different conversation. It's a conversation about tolerance and a conversation about dose.
Yeah, which is a very, very cool conversation, because it allows people to have the risk that's presented to them, and then work within that framework that they feel comfortable with, and they can keep doing that.
Right.
What I'm interested in is, cool, totally test the baseline T, looking at your human growth hormone and then insulin. What is the process for, because there's 13 pathways, we've knocked out 3, 4 we could argue with the non-genomic pathways. What's the process for picking the next thing that you're going to take on, like whether it's neurotropics or androgenic receptors? Is it client need? Is it desire? Is there
I would argue it's client preference more than anything else. It's very much like when we have a conversation about supplementation. Yeah. So I would argue the real conversation about supplementation is, first you need to understand what the client is, who the client is. Yeah. Because the first supplement you put on the table is more a reflection of who the client is than any argument about the supplements themselves. Yeah. So if you had someone who, a classic example is you mentioned about nootropics. I am quite bullish on the idea of using some type of pathway that helps promote mind-muscle connection. Yep. But mind-muscle connection is something that only happens with a degree of advanced training age. Most beginner trainers, and of course we're eliminating this, to some extent, because we're talking about, this is not a conversation for beginners, but let's just play the argument. Yeah. Let's say someone was just starting out with their training and they expressed an interest to me as a coach in nootropics. Yeah. What I would be arguing is, well, I don't know necessarily that nootropics are going to have a profound consequence for you at your point, at your waypoint in your training career, because you don't yet really have a mind-muscle connection to amplify. You tend to move, when you're beginning, we tend to move, weights through 3-dimensional space on learned patterns. Yeah. And it's only after you've been, it takes years to basically to feel you're in the mind-muscle connection. So then, therefore, logic makes sense. Any strategy that was put on the table to try to enhance that or to amplify that contact is going to have a different consequence for someone that already feels they have a mind-muscle connection versus someone that says, I don't feel that, I don't feel anything. I'm still at the biomechanics stage of training where I'm learning mechanical pathways because I can't feel that connection. Does it make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the sequence of events that you roll these things out is more than anything else about personal choice and client preference and understanding who the client is. You could very easily make the argument for this pathway next, or that pathway next, or that pathway. I think it's easy to say androgens first, growth hormone and insulin second or third, and then once you start to get into the lesser pathways, it's about personal choice.
Yeah. So if someone's got some kind of aerobic demands, mitochondrial function might be the next thing that you take on, because that's going to be beneficial versus something like nandrolone, which if their joints are beat up, that's the pathway you'd go down.
100%. So you have to sit and have it. And this is where, if there's a weakness to the black models, I like to explain that any really interesting conversation is going to put things on the table that are beneficial for us, that we can leverage. And it's reasonable to assume there's going to be challenges there.
Yeah.
The weaknesses of the Black models are there's more to learn than we had to learn yesterday.
Yeah.
And there's no question about that. There's more moving parts and there's more pieces in play. So, for a coach, it's something where you need to look at that and you need to go, I understand this is a complicated conversation that might take me several months to wrap my head around before I start deploying it with clients. But in my opinion, this is pharmacology. This is drugs. So it should take several months of study. It's not something that you watch. I don't know how you feel about this, but one of my great frustrations is, I at 55 with 41 years of training practices, I'm from the era where no one had personal training certificates. We just didn't have them, right?
Yeah.
Now, I'm not opposed to them, but what I would argue is there are some personal training certificates that you can get in a weekend. Doing. And the challenge, of course, is, what could you possibly learn in a weekend? This is a conversation that I would argue is like if you walked up and said, look, I have a really robust understanding of training practices, of nutritional practices, of over-the-counter supplement practices. I know nothing unashamed about pharmacology and I want to learn. What I would be arguing for is, well, you need to put a year of your time on the table before you start guiding others.
Absolutely.
And unfortunately, we live in a world where a year, like you want me to learn this for a year, people are shocked by that expectation. But I honestly don't think it's unreasonable. One of the challenges I have had over the years is a great many doctors have told me that I'm wasting my time, that the average person is not capable of learning enough about pharmacology to safely guide others. Now, I don't agree with that necessarily, but I do agree it's not a 1-week course.
Yeah,
it's a multi-year. I've been doing this I've been using drugs for 20 years. I've been talking about drugs for 9 years, and I'm still learning.
Yeah,
this is not a simple 1 weekend conversation. So I would argue for guys out there that are looking to learn, going, I don't know anything, I'm interested in this space. I would argue there's a thing called what's it called? The Dunning-Kruger curve. Are you familiar with that concept? So I'll just explain it for people listening. The premise is that when you open this box, very quickly you think you know everything because in 2 or 3 weeks you understand the language and the jargon and the principles. But realistically, if you keep going, you keep learning very quickly, you reach this point where you go, that's delusion. I had a self-inflated belief of what I actually knew, and then you fall into the curve of despair. Basically, this is a process that takes a long time to understand everything, enough to take people's money and act as a consultant.
Yeah. A lot of people, they do their first cycle of gear and they're like, all right, cool, sports TRT for you, 3 to 5 milligrams.
That's it.
And it's like, okay, cool. It's not that simple. And there's so many things that you need to look at.
Agreed.
It's very, very, it's unethical, really.
I would just speak today, if you don't mind, because I know your audience is coaches. It is an ethical dilemma we're in today, because historically, we took the perspective of, look, you don't need to be a doctor here, or you don't need to be you don't need to have these academic credentials, but it was always like this. At some point in your career, you will probably retire from bodybuilding, for want of a better word, right? And at that point in time, you'll have more time and more energy to mentor and to guide others. It was always a thing like, okay, I'm speaking to you with 20 years of experience, We do unfortunately have a culture today that says everybody that does a bodybuilding show is now a bodybuilding coach. One show. And this is problematic, because I come from the time that says, like, I say things and sometimes I know they come across as arrogant, but realistically, when you think about it, it goes, so I made every mistake you could possibly make. And a lot of mistakes, I made them more than once. But the difference was that I didn't start speaking publicly about drug use for the first 12 years of my exposure.
Yeah.
And so all the mistakes that I made and all the things that I messed up, and got wrong, it's not that I didn't get them wrong. I'm not on public record saying them, and I wasn't guiding clients because I was just making the mistakes. I messed it up, basically, and it was a personal issue. And the point I'm making is, so when I speak now and I say things like, and you can challenge me on anything I've ever said in 8 years, it's the time frame. I'm not saying 20 years, I'm saying 8 years, because in the first 12 years, I made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah.
And I got a lot of things wrong. And this is something that I try to encourage coaches to do, to say, there's a lot of money to be made, and there's a lot of client engagement still at natural. Yeah. And if you want to move into the enhanced market, by all means, I fully encourage people to do that. But you should really be seeing that as a journey that says, okay, maybe I'm 25 now and I have a couple of years of personal exposure and I want to start guiding others. But you really need to have some time under your belt before you start coaching and before you start speaking to others more than we do today.
Yeah, absolutely. Because people, as you said, they do a show, they're a prep coach, they can write out someone's cycle for them and then just give them a bunch of AIs at the end. It's a beautiful thing.
That's how it works. Yes, correct.
It's a beautiful thing. It's not beautiful, but yeah, there's definitely sarcasm there. Now with the model, the next thing I wanted to discuss quickly, because that's the male model. Obviously, we need to talk about the female model, because obviously the standard, just take a bunch of Anavar, isn't the best way to go for a female to prevent virilization and all that, and all the other nasty things that can happen. So with the black models, what's the basic intro step for female? Is it modulating more of these other pathways that aren't androgenic? So looking at the insulin pathway, the carnitine pathway, nootropics, etc., before you move into the hormonal approach?
Yeah. So what I would argue is that androgens, anabolic steroids, are the very, very last drug that we put on the table for women. Why? Yeah. Because at the end of the day, women are exquisitely sensitive to androgens in terms of risk for virilization. The dosages that we typically use with women don't represent significant organ toxicity.
Yeah.
And I'll just explain what I mean by that. Most people are familiar with the idea of transgender therapy, where someone was born as a woman and they now wish to identify as a physical male. Clearly, they're still biologically a woman. But the point being is that, endocrinologists are more than happy to give their patients enough androgens that they virilize them to the point where they, walking down the street, they physically identify as a man. Yeah. So interestingly, the takeaway from that would be, well, clearly they're not concerned about cardiovascular health or renal health. There is a conversation to be had about changes to the brain and cognitive structure and how we think. Yeah. But the point I'm making is, women are vastly different from men because we're not really worried about organ toxicity.
No.
Yeah. What we are concerned about with women is the consequence of exposure to androgens and the virilization that follows from that. And that changes the conversation, because what that means is our strategy for women now becomes one of saying, we want to do everything we can with drugs that are physically incapable of virilizing women.
Yeah.
So you can give a woman growth hormone and understand I'm not suggesting there's no problems with growth hormone, but you cannot physically virilize a woman with growth hormone. It's impossible.
Yeah.
You can give a woman insulin, and there are a whole bunch of problems we can talk about with insulin, but virilization, it's physically impossible. And the point I'm making here is, so if there are 13 metabolic pathways that we could modulate, we don't want to modulate the ones that result in virilization as the first pathway.
Yeah.
And why? Because if she's going to expose herself to this, to these pathways for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20 years, a degree of virilization is inevitable.
Yeah.
It's inevitable. You can't escape this. And people don't like to accept this, but all you need to do is go and watch a female physique show. Yeah. And you look at the young girls, the young bikini girls in their early 20s, and you think, what the hell are you talking about, Victor? These girls look fabulous, right? But the truth is, the cold hard ugly truth is, if you hang around long enough and you wait for the master's class to come on, mm-hmm. and you watch the ladies who are in their 40s and 50s even, every single woman on the stage, observation at least, has a degree of virilization about her. It's hard to escape. It's just true, right? And so both observationally and in the clinical literature, we know that long-term exposure to androgens will result in this thing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize that effect. And how we do that is we hold off as long as we can with the virilizing agents. We hold them and hold them and hold them as long as we can. Now, that's not saying you never expose them to, but it's completely opposed to the historical practice, which was, that's the first drugs you give them. One is, wait as long as you can before you give it to them. And the other is come straight out the gate. They're polar opposite approaches. Yeah.
Is there ever a reason to do like a testosterone therapy first if hormonal replacement therapy is indicated, or would you go through other avenues to sort that out rather than going?
I would suggest that the framework is the same for men as women. When someone steps up, you need to understand who they are. Yeah. So because of my age, a great many of my clients tend to be older. You attract similar people. This is just true in life. Yeah. So most of my clients are over 40. This is just how it is. They're attracted to the fact that I'm an older guy and have been around a lot. Yeah. And at the same time, very young people, 20s, feel that we're disconnected somehow. I don't know why, but I understand that. I appreciate this is the nature of things. Yeah. So the point I'm making is a great many of my female clients, we have them on testosterone replacement therapy. But I would argue that's not a default position. That's okay, so who is the client and where are they today? And let's be honest, if you're 23 years old, or if you're 43 years old, we're going to be having probably a different discussion about, what pathways come out when and in what order. So as a general rule of thumb, older ladies who are experiencing or approaching menopause, testosterone replacement therapy is profound. It's life-changing. It's like, wow, my sex life is back, my body composition is back. 23-year-old women given the same dose of testosterone tend to experience it more as a replacement strategy, and they don't experience you're replacing endogenous production with an exogenous source, and nothing much happens. The magic doesn't happen. So what it's kind of like the men, which pathway in what sequence and to what magnitude is determined by the client, not by a predetermined set of rules.
Yeah, which is really awesome to hear, because I learned from you, which is good, which is why I parrot back to people. But it's really good that it's a process that, it needs to be involved on like an actual client assessment, knowing your client, and not just going, all right, cool, we're gonna do this because this is my protocol. It's the lack of existence of a protocol. It's a thought process.
Correct. It's literally a consulting process where you understand the needs of the client. Let me just explain what evidence-based practice means, because I know that your coaches will understand this, but I still struggle to get people to understand. People think it's about what the science says. That's not what it says. What evidence-based medicine is about is actually something that doctors don't practice, and that's what people don't understand. It's not a medical practice. It's a proposed model that basically says, listen, not everything we know is in the body of literature. There's a great many doctors that have had 30, 40, 50 years of clinical experience that know things because they know things. Yeah. And we need to respect that. That's what evidence-based practice actually means. It's completely the opposite of what people think it means. It means, look, there are three vectors here. There's the vector of what does the clinical literature say? Yeah? There's the vector of you've been a doctor for 40 years. What have you learned in the process that's not in the literature? What does observation and experience tell you? And then there's the vector of how does the client feel about this? Yeah. Right? You're going to have clients out there that are women that are going to come to you and say, I've tried all manner of hormone replacement therapy practices. I think testosterone is something that I want to explore. The door's already opening before you take the call. Does that make sense? And they're coming to you because they want to say, look, this is where my head's at. I'm already halfway through the door, but I want to spend some time with you talking about testosterone replacement therapy for women, so that I can put what I think and what you think together, and I can then have a body of knowledge which is greater than the sum of what I started with. There are some clients that are going to think like that. There are other clients that are going to come through the door saying, oh, testosterone's not for women. Yeah. Do you understand? What the client thinks walking in the door before you even take the call, that matters. Yeah. So how I treat clients is every single client is a different, unique case, and we approach them based on not just as what the science says, not just what does my experience say, but I want to know who the client is and what the client thinks. And so you can appreciate a disproportionate number of women that come to me looking for help with this are already attracted to TRT. Yeah. They're already thinking, is this for me? Is this for me? I don't get people coming to me going, oh my God, I could never even contemplate doing that. But those people do exist.
Yeah. Right? Working with that demographic already.
Correct. So, and the point I'm making is you have to understand as a coach that you stand in this position of authority and you have to listen before you speak. Yeah, who is the client? What do they think? What are their points of view? What are their perspectives? What are the biases? What are the, all of these things matter about what we end up making as a prescription for a client. It's not just here's a framework and it applies to every single person in the world.
Love that. I really enjoy that. Like my background, well, it's my podcast, so I don't really talk about my background at all. But I come from the like more rehabilitative side of things. That's when I started 20 years ago. I was a rehab guy. It's exactly what I went into straight away. And I learned very quickly that it was always the client in front of you matters more than the actual diagnosis from an MRI or whatever the hell it was. I think
100%.
It matters. It absolutely matters. It's a consideration point, not a death sentence. So I would have clients come in with all different things, and I would put them all through a very, very similar process and apply that to rehabilitation. So this is one of the reasons why the black model appeals so much. It's a thought process. It's nearly like a decision tree, but you can break down into an algorithm to help you make
it is absolutely a decision tree. And this is one of the great frustrations. So many people, I have had people give me negative feedback about the models, and I do listen very carefully what people say. The problem is that when people tend to complain about the models, what they want is a prescription.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to suggest is, no, I understand that's what you want, but what I'm trying to explain is that this is not a prescription, it's a framework. So a client sits in front of me and we have a consultation, as opposed to, I don't know whether you've ever experienced this, but years ago you went onto a forum and someone with a nameless, faceless avatar would make a post that says, look, this is my cycle, what do you think? That kind of story. And 25 people would come along and know absolutely nothing about that individual, like not training age, not goals, they know absolutely nothing, and yet the opinions start to flow about what's wrong with the cycle. And the point I'm making is that's not what I'm selling. What I'm selling is almost like a decision-making tree. Here's an intersection, and we could go this way, or could go this way, and here's the next intersection, we could go this way or this way. And this is frustrating for people that want a prescription. They want to know which drug to take, and they want to know how many milligrams you should take and how long you should take it for. And what I'm suggesting is that's not possible. That's not possible. And that's why you need to invest time into learning the framework, because the client matters.
Yeah, absolutely. I get requests all the time from students. I'm not picking on anyone here. For someone's got back pain, someone's got knee pain. What's your protocol for that? What's your protocol for that? I'm like, I'm not a protocol guy. There's actually a module in our mentoring program called How to Ask Better Questions. It's the 4th module, and it's literally to go, if you are going to ask a question about this, first of all, is it on the damn site? That would be useful to look at. Have people read the materials of the black models before they start questioning them. And then secondly, it's like, you need to give some context around the person, how it's happened, when it's happened, whatever it is, so you can actually formulate a proper response to that. Because otherwise, person's back hurts. All right, well, is it extension, flexion based? Is it worse at night, worse in the morning? There's so many variables that you need to juggle to actually give a client a solution to their problem.
Correct. 100%. Yeah, and
a little bit of trial and error too.
100%. So, and this is where some people historically have said the models are too hard to understand, and they're not clear enough. And I'm going, I'm incredibly empathetic, but I'm not trying to offer that. Yeah. What I would like to suggest is that I should be almost like inspirational to want to learn more. Does it make sense? I know that kind of sounds kind of airy fairy, but it's like I'm even suggesting that you should listen to the frameworks and then go off and form your own opinions about these things. Yeah. And simply bounce your motivation to learn off of an evidence-based framework, that then you come back and you have your own particular take on it. The challenge is that the models are so well thought out that I'll just be honest with you, they'll never be replaced, because they're not prescriptions. A prescription will always be replaced. It will. A framework, the classic example is like this. I would argue that we lean into lifetime human clinical use drugs over research chemicals. I'm not being super specific about what drugs they are. You see what I'm saying? Yep. So when I say things like that, you're kind of going like, so a new drug comes along you're in 5 years from now, and it realizes human clinical approval and it's placed into human clinical use, that automatically means that we can consider that drug.
It qualifies for the model.
It qualifies for the model. And this is what people don't understand. The models go on forever because they're flexible enough and adaptable enough to change with, as you know, science is constantly moving forward. Yeah. And as new evidence comes to light, we need to be in a position to move it. I mean, I'll give you a classic example. Not very long ago, we recently made a shift about, if someone is injured, do we apply ice or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is a classic example. Like, so new evidence comes to light, we change the model. That doesn't mean the models were wrong. That's what we once thought was correct. And now we have better evidence to support. And so we go in a different direction, sort of thing. This is where I'm not a fan of prescriptions. I'm not a fan of, yes, you ice the model. Oh, sorry, you ice the injury. The model says, what does the evidence suggest? Yeah.
Follow that, implement, observe.
Correct.
May change
forward. Correct. Awesome.
Fine.
Okay, so we're coming up to an hour on our call, and I'm mindful of the fact that very often an hour is long enough for me listening to me go on. Do you want to ask a couple more key questions here, and then we'll probably call it? Yeah.
Oh, I'm very happy with the models. And everything you said about that, I think it gives everyone who's listened, who's going to listen, sorry, because it's not live, a lot of material to actually invest. And I hope they do get inspired to dive into it more. Because I work with a lot of coaches, obviously building a better business. Your application of the models or coaching PED use in the business framework, you've talked about that, how it can be a very simple model for someone to earn $100,000, $200,000 a year. Can you quickly touch on the way that someone would go through that? Because if some coaches of mine and people listening to this want to go down that, I want to send you to actually learn the model so they can do that, and then I can help them actually execute that into the actual financial reward.
So not very many people, I shouldn't say no one, but I don't think very many people talk about the business of coaching.
No, they don't.
Yeah. I think it's important that we should, because someone should talk about the business of coaching. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I want to start talking about is the business. And realistically, coaching bodybuilders is a terrible business model.
Yes.
Coaching people stage. And the number one reason behind that is you have to understand it works like this, and that is, there are good business models and there are bad business models. Good business models, what you really want is you want to get a moderate amount of money off a large number of people on a repeating basis. Like like restaurant models are terrible models. What they mean by that is someone comes in and has dinner on a Friday night, and then next month you have no idea who's coming through that door.
Yes,
right. I like the idea of the coaching business, because realistically, what you want to do is create a client base that are with you for 5, 6, 10 years, for life. Hell, for life. I have clients that are literally that they treat me like a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant. You're my guy in my corner that I come to when I have questions about this.
Yeah,
right? They're brilliant clients. I don't charge them a lot of money, to be honest with you. I charge them $100 an hour, and I think that's fair. When I say fair, that's what an electrician or a plumber or a master tradesman would charge, right? There are people out there charging $500 an hour and $1,000 an hour. The problem with that model is there's just not many people that can afford it, and if they can afford it, it tends to be a one-time shot. Yep. Right? I try to set my prices at a point where if someone has a question, they'll throw $100 at me. So answer my question, right? And the point I'm making is, if you agree that we should be setting our prices in similar ways to a master tradesman, and I don't see why we should charge less than a plumber. I really don't, right? Yeah. Then honestly, what I think you should be doing is saying, okay, so how many client billable facing hours do I need to sell a week, right, to make 50,000, 100,000, 200,000? And I'm quoting US dollars, but you guys can make the conversion. If you understand, so you need to have 10 billable hours a week to make 50,000 US dollars and 20 billable hours a week to make $100,000. It's a very good business.
It is, absolutely.
The problem with the business is both the strength of the business, which is there are no barriers to entry. Yeah. But what I don't think people understand is it's far less about knowledge and far more about marketing. Yeah. About your capacity to get the phone to ring. Right. And most of the really good coaches out there, when I say by really good coaches, the successful coaches out there, their business are successful because they're extremely good at marketing.
Yes.
I'll give you a simple example. I recently went to Dubai, and at the Dubai seminar, there was a couple of elite bodybuilders in the crew, 4 or 5 of them, big boys, big names, 10 pro show winners and stuff like that. You have to understand those guys have effectively bought themselves an income of $250,000 for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Because the moment they put a message on Instagram that I have coaching slots available, the phone rings. That's all they need to do. They've achieved a profile through their success on stage, which means enough people follow them and enough people want to work with them that all they need to do is say, I have a slot available, it's full. And so the point I'm making is what I don't think people understand is this is a business of 2 parts, of knowledge and of marketing. Yeah. And what we tend to lean into is people tend to be very good marketers and have horrible knowledge, right? Or they have very, very good knowledge and horrible marketing. Yeah. And what I'm trying to get people to understand is you need to do both.
You
need to do both. Now, there's 2 ways you can do that. Either you could partner with someone who and let them do the marketing. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. There's a guy called Dr. Eric Helms. Do you know who Dr. Eric Helms is?
Yep.
So I'm a huge fan of Eric, right? I think he does great work. He's very personable. He's a great communicator. But you understand that he's the spokesperson for a team of guys called 3D Muscle Journey. When he speaks, people listen to him, but you can't access him as a coach. No. His roster's not available. Does that make sense? Yeah. So he speaks and someone else in his team does the actual coaching when the phone rings. Yes. This is one model. Mike Israel does the same thing. Yep. He speaks, he has a profile, people follow him, and there's 30 coaches underneath him that fill those things. This is one model. It's a very viable model, and it's a way to scale a business, and it's exactly the same model that guys like Joe Jeffrey and Callum Raystrick and Mike Israel and Eric Helms, that it works. Someone's responsible for making the phone ring. They're the profile guy, they're the marketing guy, but they're not interfacing with clients.
They're not the delivery guy.
They're not the delivery guy. This is one model. The other model is a model where you say, look, I don't want to go down that model, because I'll be honest with you, when people make a call with me, they want to fucking talk to me.
Yeah.
They don't want to talk to some intern that's basically I'm training. They just don't.
Yeah.
Right.
I agree.
So what I would argue is then, if that's not you, then the way that you scale is you have to have an application, or you have to have a membership site, or you have to have some other, training course, something that lets you scale. Because the problem with coaching is scale.
Yeah.
It's a great business to start. It's more dependent on marketing than I think people understand. Yeah. So I just want to talk about how I think you should start. Let's say you had no clients at all. Yep. None. Right. I think what you should do is you should just find one person to work with and not charge them anything. Right. And document their journey, but be very transparent with them, saying the reason I'm not charging you is I'm going to hyper leverage your success into getting the phone to ring. And if they're uncomfortable about that, you say no. You need to find the right person. They need to make testimonials. They need to be prepared to show their face. They need to be able to, this is how much weight I lost. I lost 50 pounds or whatever like that. They need to be the right individual that's comfortable with a little bit of, being uncomfortable. Does it make sense?
Absolutely.
So picking the first client is very important. Yeah. And I would argue that picking the right client is probably the unspoken factor of success, because when you're starting out, you shouldn't be charging clients. You should be picking clients and working with them for free in return for what they can give you. Yeah. They have a little bit of a community profile. They're very well known. They have 10,000 followers on Facebook. These are all the things that you should be looking at. So if someone has a Instagram profile and a Facebook profile and it's closed, or someone has a Facebook profile and an Instagram profile and they don't show photos of themselves, I would be saying, I don't want to work with that person.
Yeah.
You're not going to get the exposure, because you need, what's going to happen is when you deliver great results for them, the very first thing that will happen is 2 or 3 of their friends will step up.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the first thing, absolutely, word of mouth, right? But you need to have the right person. And these are the things that nobody talks about. So what I would argue as a coach is, so you're learning and you're wanting to open a business, I would argue the first 3 or 4 people you work with, you should work with them for free. Yeah. But you have to be very careful about who they are, because you need them to be outgoing and happy to be in the public eye and post photographs of their progress on their own pages and make testimonials for you. And the point I'm making is, I would argue that if you took on 3 or 4 clients and you delivered great levels of service and you delivered great outcomes for them, I'm telling you, the phone starts ringing.
Yeah, you start getting inquiries, you start servicing those people, you can start charging money.
It's that simple. But it's the little twist between, I'm not interested in the money they're going to pay me for the first couple of clients. I'm interested in, how can I leverage your success into success for me?
We teach that with our ambassador program. So we get every student, you get like 3 to 5 ambassadors who are spokespeople for their brand or their training, because if you're starting
100%.
out, unless you're in a commercial facility where they're providing leads for you to actually work with, you're trying to do it by yourself. That's the only way you're going to do it. You're not going to just put your Instagram profile up and say, it's $100 for a consult, pay me. It's just simply never going to happen. I've never seen it happen.
No, agreed. So these are subtle things. These are not sledgehammer things. But when you come to realize them, you go, you know what? The first 4 or 5 clients that you work with straight out the gate, the results that you get with them and how you can leverage those results through documenting on social media, in my opinion, will determine the future success of your business. Right? And then after that, it becomes a case of, once the phone starts to ring, what you ultimately need to build is this. You need to just accept the hard reality of this, and that is that every successful coach in the world has ambassadors. I think you called them, right? Yeah. I call them sponsored clients. They're people that I want them to be super successful because they have a high profile and I can leverage their marketing. And very often I literally give my time to them for free.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that it's free. Let me explain what I mean by that is, if you take someone that is a high profile coach and they have someone they work with, what's Nick Walker's coach? Matt Jansen. Yeah. It's a classic number. These guys are buddies. These guys are friends. I mean, Matt would probably coach him for nothing. I have no idea whether money changes hands or not, but I promise you this. If money does change hands, the amount of money that comes from is not equated to the time that goes in.
Absolutely not.
There's a disconnect there. So people say, oh, I pay. Go, yeah, but you're paying for 4 hours of his time and he's giving you 20. You don't understand that, right? Yeah. And everybody needs to understand, this is the cold, hard reality of coaching. Every successful coach in the world has a number of high-profile clients that you see on rotation, right? And if you watch their Instagram, you see them come up over and over and over again, right? And they look really good and they have great results and they're willing to say, Matt's the best coach in the world, blah, 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 blah. Fabulous. Like, that's what you need. But then every other business behind that, it doesn't matter whether you're a plumber or a doctor or whatever. Everybody has a rotation of clients that are effectively nameless, faceless, unseen people that pay the bills, right? Exactly. And the point I'm making is, you need to understand how the business of coaching works so that you can be good at it. What I would argue is, the first few clients, don't worry about making. You should have enough money in the bank starting out so you can take on 3 or 4 free clients, okay? But those clients, who they are, really matter. Then once you get them, the phone starts to call, and then more and more people come in that are the bill payers. They pay the bills, yeah? And I think the biggest mistake that people make is, I want clients that are going to be with me for 10 years. Right? That's not bodybuilders. Bodybuilders tend to hop around. They're chasing, like, maybe I can either. I mean, I didn't have any problem with the idea of it, but I want someone who's a time poor, cash flow rich executive that listens, that gives me great results, that tells his friends about me, sorts of stuff. And I'm telling you, if you develop those relationships with those people, they don't leave.
Ever. My longest client's 20 years.
Ever. They don't go anywhere, ever. But no one talks about these things, right? Everyone's like, you reach out to a bodybuilder who wants to climb to stage. I'm telling you, you're going to get 2 or 3 shows max before he's going to start to want to go somewhere else. Now, also the problem that I'm just honest from a commercial protection IP point of view, right? There are no secrets here. right? But there are little subtle things that we all do that you can't really call a secret, but I think that they have intrinsic value. Yeah. And every time you teach a bodybuilder, you have to understand, but you're establishing a beachhead of a competitor of sorts, in the marketplace. I mean, and these are the things I think we should be talking about. Like, coaches need to understand how coaching really works. The high profile coaches that you see out there, they don't have a roster of 70 champions. They don't. They have 5, 6, 7 high profile ambassadors. They have 50 men that pay the bills. And the question that you need to ask yourself is, so how did they get the high profile guys? And very often the answer is, well, the first one was just they were in the right place at the right time. Yeah. The one last thing I would say is this: if you are serious about building a profile, you need to be actively looking for ambassadors.
Yeah.
You need to be going around your local area, right, looking at the top 10 gyms, and you need to be going around looking at the competitions, looking for the next big thing, as it were. You think, man, that guy's, he's like 120 pounds overweight, but he's busting his nut. Yeah. I can see that guy's gonna fucking, he wants to lose those, and then you go to him and you say, listen, I want to help you for free, but you have to understand I'm a professional coach. The reason I'm helping you for free is I want to document your journey. Are you cool with that? You go, fuck yeah, I'm into that, right? Dude, that guy's gold, man. That guy's gold, because you can see him in the gym. He's going, that guy needs to lose 120 pounds and he's busting his nut to do it, right? And you see the other guy who's on his phone, you're thinking like, dude, that guy's never going to make it. They both have the same need, but they're just completely different approaches. Yeah. Picking ambassadors is the most underspoken aspect of business development and marketing and coaching.
I think we'll wrap it up at that, Victor, because that is an absolutely awesome endpoint to go from, because what you've done today effectively for our listeners and anyone else every coach is going to listen to this, is you've given a really awesome insight into the frameworks. There's an algorithm where it encourages people to think, but you've also, both men and women, but you've also shown like a really unreal way to actually get your coaching business off the ground. So I can't thank you enough for that. That has been some really awesome stuff.
I appreciate the opportunity, Paul. When I'm going to come to Australia in 2024. Maybe you can come and visit our seminar.
If you're, well, it doesn't matter what state. I have gyms in a few states, so I'm definitely going to be there. That's cool. Awesome. And for finding you on Instagram. So Instagram is the best place to find you for social media. Victor Black Masterclass, I believe it's called.
That's the one.
Yep. I will put all those links up in the show notes. And if anyone has any questions, we'll send them straight onto your website.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate your time, buddy. Bye-bye.